The art of silence was originally a mistake made by Greek philosophers who traveled to Egypt. These individuals wished to learn the inner meaning of life that Egyptians seemed to understand a bit more of. A symbol portrayed a naked child with his finger over his mouth is what started everything. Because of Aphrodite's indiscretions, she gave a rose to her son Eros, who in turn was to give it to Hippocrates in order to make sure that those indiscretions remained silent. This was the beginning to the term sub rosa, or under the rose. The evidence can be seen all throughout history. Of course, this story was handed down from the Egyptians to the Greek and finally into the hands of European royalty and nobles. Hippocrates became Horus, of course, and silence was symbolized by the rose. In old banquet rooms, roses can still be seen. Just look up at the ceilings where you see roses. That is where secrets were to stay. What was said and done in the banquet room stayed in the banquet room. Eventually, this practice was adopted by the church too. It's now called confessional. King Louis the Seventh, King Louis the Seventh's entire family died when he was just a baby from smallpox. Because King Louis's governess refused to allow doctors to use bloodletting, he survived. Unlike his oldest brother who died earlier because of the practice. This, though, isn't part of the story, so I will move on. Being the only successor to his grandfather's throne at the age of 5, Louis VII was crowned King of France. According to history, King Louis died because of syphilis and left many illegitimate children. This was due to his cousin, twice removed, who was made regent until Louis was able to rule. Ruling in the king's place, the Duke of Bourbon, out of fear that his family might lose the throne to the House of Orleans, decided that the young king should have children as soon as possible. An heir had to be born, and before this young king was even old enough to mate, it seemed. At the age of 11, the king met his betrothed wife-to-be. For some reason, he just was not interested. Maybe if it wasn't for the fact that she was only 3, so they found him a replacement, a young princess from Poland who was old enough to conceive. It took 3 pregnancies, but finally an heir was born. At an early age, the king was introduced to sex. His thirst was unquenchable. Many female visitors appeared at the palace for late-night visits, and many children out of marriage were conceived. Because the king needed heirs to the throne, royalty placed sex above everything else. Henry VIII, what a bastard he was. The women he married and divorced at will, leaving the church for his desire for flesh, and at the end of his life being handicapped. His lack of children, though, and no male who could inherit his kingdom. This again brought the need for an heir. With one wife, he became so furious that he framed her for incest and adultery, claiming her to be a whore who had sex with family members. Being gracious, though, he allowed for her beheading to be done with a sword instead of with the customary blunt axe. it is now known about King James and his homosexual tendencies too. How frequently playhouses, how he frequented playhouses and always in the company of young male companions. The idea that playhouses in London were not too reputable in those days, that would be unthinkable to most intellectuals today. Such foolishness. It's true though. Only reprobates and homosexuals attended, and no royal subject would be caught there. This, though, isn't spoken. Stories concerning King James, Francis Bacon, Chris Marlowe, and Shakespeare himself have arisen from this topic. Some have claimed that Shakespeare did not exist. Mark Twain even traveled to London to investigate himself. Walt Whitman made a comment on the subject, but took no stance on the topic, of course, probably out of fear that his own sexual preferences would be questioned. Was Shakespeare a pen name for someone else to write under? Could it be true? Boogery and sodomy surround and slander his family name. His son-in-law was supposedly arrested for it. His writings and the people he worked with were entrenched in it. Oh, but none of this could be true, could it? Oh, but who could leave out the mystery of mystery? Saint Germain himself. It is hard to tell if he was a forger, a thief, a lover, or just plain crazy man. His story went down as legend, mystery, and folklore all at the same time. It is really hard for anyone to say if this man really even existed. He played footsies with royalty and nobles during wild orgies, proclaiming that he was 300 years old, the son of an exiled nobleman from Romania, Francis Rakoczy, the second one, that is. He was a musician and a scientist who wrote better than most and could make diamonds out of thin air. He was hiding from the House of Habsburg because of his family name, and visited royalty with ease. Taught the art of music by his uncle, Guillaume Gaston, and raised by a homely duchess, Violante Beatrice. He was either conceived by her and Rakoczy, or she took him as her own. It isn't quite clear. I've heard two stories, one of his mother being a homely noblewoman with a homosexual husband. Rakoczy, of course, had sex with her out of sympathy, too. He was mentioned by Voltaire, Casanova, and Charles of Hesse-Kassel. Hesse-Kassel? And Charles of Hesse-Kassel was known to have befriended him, with claims of alchemy being used, creating jewels, fabrics, dyes, and cosmetics, of course. Whether Saint Germain existed or not, it doesn't really matter. The story that was told was profound. During those days, secrets were kept and folklore brought them out. Rakoczy, his family, and his family before him suffered at the hands of their enemies. He fled for his life and ended up in Constantinople in exile for turning against the Holy Roman Empire. All of his life, his father's life, and his grandfather before him, their family was always held hostage. When wars were ended, hostages were taken in order to keep peace among the people. Orders of chivalry, like the Order of the Golden Fleece, would choose families among their own noblemen in order to take them as hostages. They were taken into custody, but not put into prison. Instead, they stayed in castles that belonged to members of the order. At the time when Rákóczi was still in Romania, there were many struggles between Romanians, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. In order to fight against the Spanish, Leopold I had to make peace with the Ottoman Empire. By doing this, Romania had to pay tribute to the Ottoman Empire too. Politics during those times were confusing. Not only did the Ottomans have power over Romania, the Holy Roman Empire did too. Rákóczi and all of his family could have been princes, but they were forbidden to sit on the throne by the Ottoman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire would repeatedly take the Rákóczi family as hostages. Sorting out the process is still kind of confusing, but I intend to write more about it because it's pretty interesting to learn about in all of the works. Orders which were regulated by knights, nobles, and royal families, such as these, caused individuals who weren't in those classes to create secret societies. That is why the Rosicrucian, Freemasons, and other Hermetic groups were created. In Germany, if you were accused of committing a crime, you were summoned to a hearing held by a secret court. Instead of getting your summons in person, it was nailed to your door. A tree or someplace where you went. The only sentence for any crime was death. If you found out who members were in the court, then you were sentenced to death also. In order to be cleared of charges, you had to take oaths in court. If you were a member of the court, you had to take oaths in court if you were a member of the court. If you weren't, and you had a family member who was, then that family member had to take the oaths. If nobody in your family was a member, then a percentage of the members had to agree to take oaths on your behalf. That is when most criminals would decide to run, usually somewhere that wasn't ruled by the Holy Roman Empire. So next time you hear about an old folklore or a story that has been passed down from one generation to the next, remember, there might be something to that story that is important. People from long ago didn't have the freedom to express themselves like we do today. The story of Hansel and Gretel tells us a story that most aren't aware of. That is because most people have never read or have even heard about the original version. Hansel and Gretel were both abandoned in the forest by their mother and father. This story was inspired by an epidemic that occurred in Germany a century before the story was written. Parents were so poor that they would end up dumping their children in the woods because they could no longer feed them.